Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're going to pull back the curtain on the invisible architecture that runs our world, all those global institutions. We're going to look at their pretty surprising origins, their immense power, and, the growing fear that the entire system might just be rotting from the inside out.
Well, the answer lies in a global rulebook. But what's so fascinating is that this whole system didn't start with some grand political treaty. Nope. It all began with something way more practical. Just solving the logistical headaches of a newly connected world way back over 150 years ago.
Okay, so let's go right back to the beginning. The very first international rules, they weren't about preventing wars or forging these big alliances. They were just about making brand new technologies, like the telegraph actually, work when you crossed a border.
Right, so think of these as kind of the original beta tests for global cooperation. They were born out of pure necessity, dealing with things like river trade, mail, and telegraph signals. This was all about function, not philosophy.
And you can see the progression right here. I mean, in 1815, the problem was as simple as, how do we get barges down a river we all share? Fast forward to 1865, and now the challenge is standardizing Morse code so your message doesn't turn to gibberish at the border. And by 1874, you get the Universal Postal Union, a true unsung hero of globalization, which basically created a single postal territory for the entire planet.
So, with all the success of these technical agreements, the world got a little more ambitious. They tried a political version, the League of Nations. But it was a spectacular failure. Why? Because it had no real enforcement power, no teeth. It was all talk, no action. And in the end, it couldn't stop the Second World War. And that catastrophic failure taught a really brutal lesson that would shape everything that came next.
All right, so out of the ashes of World War II, this brand new ambition emerged. The world's leaders were absolutely determined to build a much stronger system, a grand design that was meant to prevent a global catastrophe from ever happening again.
And at the very heart of this new order, of course, stood the United Nations. Its mission was both incredibly simple and profound: be the world's great forum for diplomacy, a place to talk out problems instead of fighting them out.
But here we see the central conflict that's baked right into the UN's design. For all its successes, the Security Council can be completely paralyzed by a single veto from just one of its permanent members. This creates this massive gap between the UN's really ambitious mission and its often gridlocked political reality.
So alongside the UN, two financial giants were born. First up, you've got the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. Its job is basically to be the world's economic emergency responder, stepping in with short-term cash to stop a country's financial system from completely going up in flames.
And the IMF's twin is the World Bank. So if the IMF is the firefighter rushing to the scene, the World Bank is the long-term contractor. It provides these massive loans for huge projects. We're talking dams, bridges, schools, all with the goal of kicking off development and reducing poverty. And the system just kept expanding from there. You had military alliances like NATO, kind of the shield formed for collective defense. The World Health Organization, the MEDIC, was created to coordinate how we respond to global health crises. And then you've got the European Union, a really unique experiment in trying to turn an economic community into a political superstate.
So, if this system was so comprehensive, so grand, why are we talking about it rotting? Well, the core problem is that this whole architecture, designed for the world of 1945, is now facing the pressures of a very different 21st century.
And right at the root of the problem is this. The power structure of these institutions is basically a photograph taken in 1945. The world has changed immensely, but the core leadership, the ones with the real power, is still frozen in time.
Now, have a look at this list. The really interesting thing isn't who is on this list of permanent veto-wielding members, it's who isn't. Just think about the economic and demographic powerhouses of today.
Yeah, the numbers are pretty stark. Asia holds nearly 60% of the world's population, but it has only one permanent seat on the Security Council. Meanwhile, you've got zero permanent representation for the entire continents of Africa or Latin America. This imbalance is a massive and growing source of tension.
And beyond just who's represented, there's a huge debate over the methods of the IMF and World Bank. To get a loan, countries are often forced to accept these conditionalities, things like privatizing state-owned industries and cutting social spending, which can be incredibly painful for their citizens.
Wow, that one phrase, it powerfully captures the criticism, doesn't it?
It suggests that wealthy nations are using financial aid and spreadsheets not just to help, but to impose their own economic ideology on developing countries in a way that kind of echoes colonial-era power dynamics.
And if all that wasn't enough strain, you've got populist movements railing against what they call unelected global bureaucrats. And at the same time, powerful countries are more and more using funding as a weapon, threatening to pull money from organizations like the WHO when they just don't like a policy.
So, does all this pressure mean the system is just going to collapse? Well, not necessarily. The more likely outlook is actually something different, a splintering of the global order into competing, parallel systems.
And this brings us to a really key shift. Rising powers aren't just complaining about the old system or trying to leave it, they're actively building their own. Instead of fighting to reform the club, they're just starting a rival one across the street. This is what people are starting to call the parallel order.
You can see this trend of duplication so clearly here. For the Western-led World Bank, you now have the new development bank, led by the BRICS nations. To challenge the US dollar-dominated SWIFT payment system, countries are creating their own currency bridges. And the exclusive G7 club of wealthy nations, it's now rivaled by the expanding BRICS Plus group.
But it's not just about duplication. Some institutions are just being neutralized or, well, defanged. A perfect example is the World Trade Organization. Key members have blocked appointments to its appeals court, basically paralyzing it. So while the WTO still exists on paper, it's lost its teeth. Its ability to settle disputes and enforce global trade rules has been completely gutted.
This marks a really profound change. We're moving away from that post-war ideal of universal membership, where everyone's in the UN, and we're moving towards a world of exclusive clubs, where it's much more about picking your team and your allegiance.
So what's the ultimate takeaway here? The system probably won't just vanish. Our world is way too interconnected for that. But its political core is facing a genuine crisis, a 1914 moment where the old rules simply don't match the new balance of power. And this leaves us with a critical and pretty unsettling question. What happens when the global rulebook no longer applies to everyone on the field?